Hi there. We're now joined by Nicole Gallant, and it seems like she is across the world. I'm very much really interested in what she has to say. She's been a long-term friend of mine, probably for pretty much all my life. But I have also known her as a woman in leadership in all different realms, whether social, from a family perspective, and in the career and workforce. And so I thought it would be really relevant to expand the series with international guests and those that are outside a single particular industry, and covering multitudes of perspectives is really important for women like us and the audience therein. What I believe is important for the audience here, which are predominantly the targeted audience for millennial generation and Gen Z, it is to really give that profound realism of what is happening today, what happened in the past, what could be the pivotal change for the future, and putting that accountability on the audience. There's so many things that you and I could have learned earlier and pivoted earlier, made some changes in our career, made different choices in our career. But we didn't have a chance and luxury of having that mentorship group in a lot of cases. And so what we have learned is from the trial and error, the challenges, the pitfalls, the successes that we have. I believe this particular forum and the platform Women Like Us is really to provide a little bit more context of what we went through and helping those behind us and women who are just getting into the workforce or just going into university and trying to figure out where their career trajectory is. and figuring out what are those experiences that I can learn from. And I will make my own mistakes. That is pretty much a reality. But could I delve into what are the experiences out of women leaders across the world, get their perspective, and then collaborate with that of what's in my mind, and then make the appropriate decisions thereafter. So that is really the context for why we have established this particular network. And I know you have so much in terms of a give back mantra yourself. And so it'd be great for you to introduce yourself, your career backdrop, where you are today, and how you believe you can help out in this particular objective. And then I'll ask you some of the core questions.
Well, I want to say thanks, Esther, for even including me in this series, because I know this is sort of a passion area for you, and your commitment to giving back and then also uplifting other women is really, key to who you are and how you do your work and how you've moved forward in the world. And it's an honor to be a part of the conversation. So thank you. A little bit about my background and why I am actually glad to be a part of this conversation. It's true, I have worked in the for-profit sector. I worked in the investment banking and trading sector for a little while. I worked in philanthropy for many years, which meant I got to see sort of the independent sector at work. This sort of space where for-profit and nonprofit come together. And I worked in nonprofit as well. So I got to work with the United Way Network and other social enterprises that sort of are on the other end of the spectrum from the investment banking world. And now I'm working for an organization called the WomenLIKEus, where I'm one of the directors, and our goal is really to bring several strategies and tools to women to be greater, to realize their greatest lives and their greatest potential, and also to do that in community with other women who are going through the same process.
Awesome.
We spend a lot of time working with organizations, with pretty big companies and some nonprofit organizations as well, to help them advance their women's networks and really leverage and realize the full potential of women in their organizations. So this is a really exciting conversation to be a part of. Thanks.
It's important to realize the state that we're in now because of the Black Lives Movement program initiative, what the reality is today in the workforce, and trying to apply this in everywhere that we tend to be a community with. And I don't believe this should be a moment in time that we focus on this issue. We've had a systemic issue for so many years that it's hard to believe we're in almost 2021, and with COVID, everything passes by in 24 hours. So I'm going to call it 2021 because it's probably going to be that very shortly. And it just seems that while time passes, the issue still stays around. And so one of the core questions I wanted to ask you is, just out of your early experiences in professional workforce, what your earliest experience for racism in the workforce was. I shared my bit on my high school and university type of working gigs. And one of the things that had come up in theme is really that covert nature and overt nature of racism, because sometimes in my early career, but even just in COVID times when there has been a little bit more racism put toward the Asian community, just because of the realm of what the US president is saying, and then those that catch on to that and create their own reality. And what ends up happening is you don't sometimes realize it's racism. It's somewhat not in your face, but then you don't realize it until after the fact. And so have you experienced, whether that's covert or overt nature of racism in the workforce? What's your earliest experience? And then if you would segue to, how would you react differently today if you were to experience that versus back then?
I think this is a good question because it's something that as a person of color, but also as a woman, it's a really complicated space to sort of have to navigate. On the one hand, I think it's really difficult to remember my very first experience with racism in the workplace because I can't separate that from my experiences dealing with sexism in the
Yes.
workplace.
Bingo.
So it is something that's where I find that there's a really strong interrelation between those two, and what we call an intersection between your gender and your ethnic identity or your identity that means that all of your interactions with others are packaged in a way that takes both of those, or maybe 3 or 4 of those different components of your identity, all into one experience. So to say that, I did have difficult conversations as a woman in the workplace. I can remember in one instance where I was a part of a conversation with a bunch of gentlemen. I was sort of the quiet one in the room. I was definitely the most junior person in the room. And sort of a really snide remark was made about another man being very effeminate, and the implication was that he was gay, and that was not okay. Then that was difficult for me to say, okay, well, I have a reaction to that as someone who I'm not gay, but I was offended. I felt like it was an inappropriate remark, and it also, if there had been a gay person in the room, I would have had probably, maybe something wouldn't have been said. But the implication was I was junior, I was a woman, and I was straight. And so I probably wouldn't say anything or call it out. And then I think in coming forward and saying this comment made me feel very uncomfortable, I think that it's inappropriate for the workplace. And then also coming out and saying it and knowing that as a Black woman, and as I think I was maybe the only Black woman in the place at that time, I felt like it was not necessarily a risky thing to do, but it was a challenging thing to do. And I knew that it put me in a really unique space as that woman, that we've heard that before, she's the one who called out this, remark. And apparently it made her feel uncomfortable. And then also being outspoken as a woman of color. I get that a lot. So it's really difficult for me to even think about instances that were difficult without, I guess, being able to successfully pull apart whether it was because I was a woman, whether it was because I was a woman of color, was it because I was straight, or the perception was, I think, one place I think they hired me because they thought I was gay. And so they thought, well, we're ticking a whole lot of boxes. We've got a Black, gay, woman on the workforce. So it's really, it's really complex. And I think that means for young women coming into the workforce that what you have to do is, it's always the onus is very often on us, but you have to listen. You really have to understand and listen to what's being said. You have to be able to do that work of really analyzing, was this a comment about me? Was this a comment that was made because there was some assumption that, I probably wouldn't call it out? Was this a comment about another group that's being marginalized, and there's some expectation that I'm gonna support that or not challenge that marginalization? And even do the work of thinking about, I think what you referred to earlier, Esther, is what we call dog whistle racism. Because it's something that's, the idea is it's done in a pitch that's so high that you can't always hear it, you don't always know it, but something feels wrong.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that term. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So another reason this is an interesting conversation for me is because I did a degree in African American studies, and so I spent a lot of time looking at and thinking about this kind of an issue from the perspective of many different ethnic groups. Someone did come up to me and decided to share a joke with me about the Chinese community here. I live in southeastern Europe, and about what then we called it was the coronavirus. It hadn't been called COVID-19 yet, and sort of made I think a really morose joke that I think they thought because I'm not Asian that I would get in on it or make light of it or think no big deal. And it was awful, and I had to call it out, and I had to sit down. I think it was also told to me in front of my children, who kind of couldn't make sense of it. And so I had to do that work of, okay, I'm a mother, I'm a person of color, I'm an ally to people who are in the Asian community. And again, it's the woman who's, going to be, speaking up and saying, this isn't okay to say in front of others. And I actually had arguments with other people, two white people in particular, about the fact that I had planned to come forward and really, have a serious chat with these folks about the joke that they shared with me. Because there was this idea, well, they don't really know better. Well, they didn't really mean it that harmfully. Well, there's all these excuses that were sort of wrapped around this comment, but I clearly needed to respond, and I knew there was an obligation for me to think about what was said, to package my message in a way that it would be heard, create more room for conversation. So I even had to think about questions that I had to ask,
right,
to be able to have a dialogue, because you can't just come back and say, that's racist. That's going to shut everything down.
I've known you for probably almost 4 decades, and you are very consistent in listening, kind of digesting. I know that we all have the innate automatic nature of having that impulsive reaction. However, you're very good at unraveling the question to get more insight and data on why a person has said something, because you don't want to make a certain conclusion. And it's been very consistent over the many decades. And it's really poignant only because, Women Like Us is not just to share our experiences, but what are the tools that these girls need in terms of trying to moderate a situation like that, because it's very easy to just be impulsive and react. And the tool, hints and tips, whatever you want to call it, from what you have just said is very important to monitor the situation. Is it a pattern? And then be also passionate about being reactive in a way that's going to be productive, and then allowing potentially that person or persons who are around you to reflect later on, because that reflection is key to pivotal change in the near future if they choose to change, versus demanding some kind of reaction that you believe they should have, and the defensive nature comes up and they're never going to change.
Actually, add on to that, in thinking about the question and thinking about questions that can invite a conversation, and in thinking about not actually reacting to what they said, but responding to what they said, because I think there was a difference. I didn't respond right that same day. It took some time. I planned it out. And I let them know that I wanted to talk to them about it. So even they had time to think, oh, okay. And I know they were very nervous and very concerned, but when we had the conversation, I had the chance to say, it concerned me, but also I really wonder how this might feel to you if this situation, if you were put in this context or in this situation. And then it opened up a conversation where they said, we had that experience. We were Muslims in a majority Christian country during 9/11. And we were being ostracized, and we felt that, and we, so we get it. So we use comedy, or we use laughter to sort of, deal with the stress and the challenges.
Yes.
But we also have to, and then it turned into this whole conversation about how we have to think about how we are either supporting or actually really bringing down other people by the way we frame these kinds of interactions with others. So, so then it turned into a dialogue, and then it turned into a conversation, and then it turned to something positive that we could, you know, where we still see each other. Because otherwise, and the FemLink does a lot of work on something we call cultural curiosity. If you don't encourage people to be curious about others, you're not inviting them into a conversation and a dialogue about others. You're really defining the space and shutting down the chance for an exchange. There's, especially in the corporate workplace, you know, if you're not trying to even ask people like, about why it matters that Black Lives Matters protests are happening, you know, folks can put out a statement, but if there isn't any reflection about why it's important or if it's important, and then that reflection that they have to do to determine whether or not they're going to, you know, take a stance, what kind of a stance they're going to take, how they're going to follow up, you know, if you shut it down, you're not going to get anywhere. But if you want a dialogue and if you want change, you want action, then you have to have a dialogue, you have to have an exchange, you have to have a conversation.
What do you believe still needs to improve in the workforce, whether private or public sector? And you have come from North America and first world to that of second, third world, and have expanded your travels therein. And so having that global perspective, what can you say still needs work? And what do corporations need to push themselves on, that they're walking the talk and not just talking? Because there's a lot of talking.
I think first thing I'll say is that now that this is the third country I've lived in, and I am fortunate to have had sort of good, really rich, long experiences in each of those countries. And here I'm in the linguistic minority. I'm in definitely the ethnic minority, definitely sort of the exceptional, you know, community. In that there's very, very few people like me here. Reticent to talk about first, second, or third world. I am thinking much more about culture and culture as something that's just, it's differentiated depending on where you go, but it's not hierarchical, because there are ways that people interact with one another here, very, you know, deep, rich, passionate, like, you know, emotional relationships that are, that convey a level of civility and respect for other humans in a way that I didn't experience in the first world of North America. The framework that you live in and the framework you come from and the context and how that shapes your interactions with people. You know, the statements that people make and the way that they follow up on them, the way that they act on those statements, is something that, you know, it's very interesting seeing the Black Lives Matter movement sort of really come into its own while I'm not in the United States, because I spent so much time working on racism and anti-racist, you know, education and everything when I was there. So it's very interesting to have this perspective from, you know, one step removed. A lot of companies and a lot of corporations are, and a lot of nonprofits, a lot of organizations all across the spectrum are kind of coming to terms with the fact that, you know, the request that's being made of them, it's pretty basic. I think for a long time, just the message wasn't being heard. People just weren't understanding the context, the framework. Black Lives Matter. Sure, all lives matter, blue lives matter, you know, blah, blah, blah. Sure. But when it comes down to the data that's showing you whose life is treated in one way or another, and then it also comes down to, you know, people expressing their voices so loudly that it's hard not to hear them. And it comes down to really a 3-word request: please, the bar is really low. We just want our lives to be treated with the same amount of dignity and respect as every other lives. It's not that all lives matter. All lives are not being treated the same around the world. And so I think for companies to do the work of really appreciating what Black Lives Matter mean, it means that they have to be enabled to have a dialogue and do the analysis, I think, about what it means in their context and how they are wittingly or unwittingly actually contributing to one or another part of the challenge. So if you believe that Black Lives Matter and you want to put that statement out, that's great. You also then have to go beyond the statement, which is what is the new hashtag that the Black Lives Matter folks are saying, you know, great. Tell us how, you know, you're going to go beyond the statement that you issued. Help us understand the work you're willing to do and the time you're willing to commit and the resources you're willing to commit. How much of a priority is this for you? So I think there are more and more organizations that are willing to do the work. I think a lot of folks are frustrated because they don't know where to start. And then there are organizations like ours, but there are lots of organizations out there that are figuring out how to help folks work through issues of implicit bias and equity and question that. I think there's also some work and reflection that companies have to do to understand how and why it relates to them and their bottom line.
What is your position and perspective when I then bring up the word policy, and what is that balance between mandating a company or companies in a certain country because of country level, federal level regulation on hiring visible minorities, and they have coined the term the feeder system in terms of allowing for certain demographic to get a certain percentage of jobs, and they have done the same thing with policies with women's rights and with women's equality, and we've seen some pivotal changes happening. Again, probably not as much as we would all like. It is likely that we have to do some type of mandated work effort and not just accountability on who's going to join this Black Lives Matter program within the company to talk about things, right? So it has to be something a little bit more practical, a little bit more quantifiable, a little bit more driven by metrics, I believe. And there is that context, the opposite context of, well, then does someone have to lose for someone to gain, right? So
yes.
how do you balance that out in an organization, again, whether public or private sector, of mandating policy, but as you had mentioned earlier, because we're starting at different points in our lives, right? A lot of the social media coverage had delved into some major themes in that the starting point of a Caucasian white male is very different from that of a Black female in the first world nation. It's a very different starting point. And so how do we gain strides, make the policies that need to be executed while ensuring that people don't lose out, and those who have qualifications still have the opportunity?
Which is, these are all really big questions. And I think this is a very rich conversation for many reasons. I think you are talking about at least three things here that I can follow up on. One is language. One is, who is controlling the narrative? How are you shaping the story of what it is your vision might be and how you're going to get to that? So how are you really telling a story that truly includes everybody at the organization, right? And an understanding of what we could be as a company if we really realize the full potential and if we invite the full set of voices and the full set of contributions of everybody. I think you're also talking about values, because as much as I know that mandates, certain policies around equity can get you the numbers, the question is, again, depending on that vision, what values are people bringing to the table? So to be able to say, well, we have 50% Latina women and 50% white men on our board is great. The question that you really have to ask yourself is also, if you think about those metrics in a holistic way, it's the numbers, it's what you can quantify, but it's also what you can qualify. What is it you're working toward? So if you as a company actually are understanding that, for example, your customer base could grow if you were to design a product that actually responded to the needs of this community that you haven't been focusing on before, then you need other voices at the table to be able to create that kind of product or those solutions to be able to do that. And just because you have people of color at the table, just because you have women at the table, it does not mean you're going to have change necessarily. There are just as many people of color committed to the status quo and sort of in it for, self-serving reasons as there are people who are not people of color who are doing the same. So I think you have to look at who is at the table, what's the value set they're going to bring, and how you are creating space for to bring that right set of values together to realize a new vision. Understanding of how and when policies can advance and when they can sort of, prevent innovation and development and evolution. So policies that are guidelines that are going to help you make better decisions about, really, again, more equity, bringing values into the conversation, inviting and holding and resourcing the space for more voices and more people and more perspectives, developing guidelines and ways to approach that and making sure that you're growing and thinking about it and willing to use guidelines rather than use pressured mandates, you're going to get a very different outcome. Start with the vision, and you're able to do that reflection and an analysis and really then develop and identify the tools that are going to keep you growing. You're going to find that the changes will come. You will start to line up issues like pay parity with equity in the distribution of people and access in the workforce. There's a whole bunch of ways to approach it, but again, I think it's a big conversation, and I think there's lots of ways to break it down depending on where you're starting. Here, we hear a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals, which is definitely not a driver for organizational frameworks in North America. But lots of companies here are focused on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which have gender equity as one of the key goals. Income equity is another goal. So, and climate. So there are different ways and different frameworks that people are using sort of to set some of those objectives. And then it depends on where you're starting, how you opt into them and how you then help advance them.
We have this notion of gotcha questions that you really close up each episode. And it's one that you weren't anticipating, and I promise it won't be that hard. If you were to have one thing that you could hope for that you see in your lifetime from that context of racism in the workforce and change, what would that be?
Yeah, that's definitely a gotcha question. When you know you're marginalized and you're isolated and there isn't a community of people like you, so the more room that women create for other women like them to be able to come into that workplace, to be able to support and enable one another, and to understand and really have that dialogue to be able to ultimately shift the balance. I think that would be just remarkable. If, from a Gen Xer who has Gen Z kids, girls, for them to think that it's the norm, that there is, safety and support for women in the workplace, no matter which industry they go into, that would be phenomenal, just as a baseline. Just like Black Lives Matter is a pretty low bar, just for women to feel safe in the workplace would be remarkable. And then to build from there and to say that not only they feel safe, but they are enabled to create community, and that they do that work for and with one another, so that there is sort of uplift as a community in sectors and in the workplace.
No, we'd love to join your community and patch together the patchworks of women across the globe. And that's probably one of the themes around us getting together, is how do we do these links so that we can become a stronger voice in communities around the globe. So I wanted to thank you once again, and we'll probably have you on again, because it's really important to get everybody's insights and perspectives. And I've always appreciated yours, having not always agreed, and begging to defer, and having all those experiences is part of life. Not everybody is going to agree with you. And I hate to have this particular position or platform that only voices one perspective. So thank you again for sharing your point of view. Hi, everyone. We're back again, and we have yet another guest speaker with us. Trish, welcome to Women Like Us.
Hi.
We are debuting in the first few episodes here, and this is one of many in regards to racism in the workforce, because as you know, you can't cover racism in the workforce in 30 minutes.
No.
It's not that trivial. With that, before I pose some of these key questions, I'd like the audience to know a little bit more about you, Trish, your backdrop, and a quick intro to who you are, what career roadmap you had gone through, and where you are today.
Sure. So I have been working for many years in several different industries. I started off actually in the healthcare industry, and I was working in that industry, I'd say, for about 5 years. Then I switched to finance, from finance to insurance. And now I'd say for the last 14 years, I've actually been with the same employer in the not-for-profit industry, and more in the environmental services industry specifically. And at this point, I'm basically looking to stay within my realm. I'm actually a project manager, so I'm actually interested in staying within that realm of project management, but I'm looking for the next opportunity at this point in time in my career.
Because it is pivotal that our audience knows that even in the maturity of our career, there's always an opportunity for change.
Exactly.
In the particular industries that you have worked through, what was your earliest experience in the workforce where you actually had some challenging issues with coworkers and or leadership
Right.
in the workforce, where you felt racism at play? What was that earliest experience for you?
Actually, funny enough, my earliest experience of that was my very first job. My very first job was one that I obtained when I was 13 years old. I was applying to work in a nursing home at the time. And at the time, I was told, not by the person that was in HR hiring me, but by a someone that a nurse that was actually working in the home at the time, who told me about the position in the first place. She told me in confidence that, you know what, Trish, it seems as though they're hesitant in hiring you because you're Black. She said, they are afraid that the residents in the home are going to be uncomfortable with you working there. My very first job. very first, time applying and going through any kind of a process. And that's basically what I was told. Now, as it
Well,
turned
how
out,
did that reaction
yeah,
impact you moving forward? Because I
yes,
would think that that is something not trivial that
yeah,
stays with you.
absolutely. And so as in that light, it has stayed with me, I believe, throughout my entire career. So what it did was it made me hyper aware of
Yes, I
always
love that
being
word. Yeah.
right, always being conscious of the fact that, no matter where I'm applying to, and what job and position I'm applying for, that race can and could always be a factor of me being hired for a position. Um, so that, I think, has shaped it actually shaped my behavior, it shaped the way that I present myself. I think you and I have talked about that. Um, in so many aspects, not just professionally, but actually throughout my entire life, just as a person, as a Black woman.
A little bit more of an elaboration that I like to
Yeah,
ask of you, because some people don't actually know what that means
yeah,
when you're hypersensitive to
right,
a situation because of the racial manner that you are
right.
perceived a certain way. How did that impact you following that incident?
Okay.
And how does that impact you today?
Or I'm always striving to look not professional in all situations when it comes to work. Yes, actually, specifically regarding work, when I'm presenting myself in a professional environment, I always make sure that I am, you know, tastefully, professionally well dressed. Nothing to obviously nothing revealing, and nothing that anyone would deem as unprofessional. I actually strive to be even more professionally dressed than probably more most people put
You
into it.
up the ante
Yes,
almost extra 3 levels
yes,
because you're trying to
absolutely.
compensate, if that's an
That's
appropriate
exactly it.
term.
That's exactly when I look around and I see my other coworkers, they might not be quite as professionally dressed as I am at, at most of the time. They're a little more relaxed in their dressing, let's say, whereas I'm not. And I've always been that. No matter what job I've had, I've always done that. Same with the way that, so okay, so my dressing is one thing. I I look at the whole image, including the way that I present my hair, everything. My hair, as Black women watching this will know, is a big thing.
Well,
So,
it's not even a funny matter because I had asked my Black friends who were models in the
right,
industry, and one of them had mentioned, Esther, the racism in our workforce in the modeling industry or entertainment industry isn't as bad as corporate. It's almost boring in the context that they would ask you, well, does your hair get curly? And we want it flattened. And I was actually
right,
taken back. I was so shocked that they would ask that. Now, obviously, now they're trying to compensate that much more and have a lot more diversity in
yes,
larger scaled women models that have facial blemishes, and
right,
those models who may not fit the stereotypical perfect nature of a body. And I believe actually in the fashion and modeling industry, there has been some strides, but
yeah,
it's important to note that, to your earlier point, that she had to be cognizant about how her hair looked so that it would cater more to the non-Black audience. And
right,
that's the profound moment of interest that we're trying to hone in on, is you
right,
have to take the same type
yes,
of impressionism in the professional workforce so
yeah.
that you're not deemed a certain way.
Right. So along the lines of wanting to straighten my natural hair, which I've been doing forever. This today is not. And actually, I've not been straightening this for, I'd say, for the last several weeks. But when I go to work and I'm actually in my office and working in my professional environment, my hair is either straightened, it's pulled back, or I'm wearing wigs and hairpieces.
What I find important to share with the audience, and especially for the visible minority audience, is at some point is the reality we have to tame back who we are
Right.
in our representation, and what does that do to us in the workforce, so that there isn't that compromise that's too much of a compromise. So what's your
Right.
position on
The only reason that sometimes I would feel that it's, it's something that everyone needs to think about, as far as, I shouldn't say everyone, all Black women need to think about when they're actually putting themselves out there and trying to apply for positions in whatever company that they're looking to work in, is how, unfortunately, how the other person is going to perceive you, and how they're going to perceive your image if it doesn't align with their own, I guess, perceptions of what a professional look is. I remember one telling me, she was in a manager position at the time, and she was telling me that before she was promoted, it was recommended to her that she either pull her hair back or straighten it, because it didn't come across as being very professional looking.
the earlier question when I had asked for your earlier experience?
Right.
How would you react differently if that were to have happened today? Because I
Oh,
know you are a very bold
yeah,
person and individual. You
yeah,
have a very firm stand in our teenage years or in high school, have
right.
taken such a situation and potentially just,
Swallowed it down.
well,
Yeah, which is what I did do with that first job. It's wrong on so many levels, and it's also illegal. Um, so, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't want to work in an environment that anyone had those views towards me in the first place, blatantly, that I was aware of. But first of all, I wouldn't even want to work in that for that company. Let's say if I found out that that was something that they had said about me and had feelings towards me in that regard, and Blacks then in general, if that was the case, I wouldn't work there. Also, would probably make it known, public, publicly, um, call them out for it, because that's something that no one should stand for. That kind of behavior would not even be remotely acceptable
and the
these days.
mantra that we have for Women Like Us platform is really trying to pave the way for those behind us. And so for the younger women leaders that are up and coming, we want to make sure that we are bold for them. How would you prescribe them to deal with those
Deal with
situations?
them now. Examine, first of all, my relationship with that person, my professional relationship and rapport with that person. And depending, I would analyze, because that's just the person I am, the intent of it. Then, based on that, use it either as a teaching moment to basically let them know, hey, what you said was not okay. It was it was microaggressive, anti-Black behavior, and the reasons why. There had been times in the past where, I've had coworkers who have, again, let's say something along the lines of my hair. Oh, is that all your hair? Is that yours? Can I touch it? These kinds of things. Or, because of the way that I speak, I don't have any accent, let's say, as a person of color. And I don't, let's say, speak with what people might call a typical Black inflection. So, oh, you sound, as though you're very white. Where were you born, or where are you from, and these
Yeah,
kinds
so
of
the
things.
Black backhanded compliment.
Yes, exactly. So that kind of stuff, and is what I've done, depending again on the person that is coming from, the intent, because that's something you would know right off the bat. If someone's intentionally just trying to be, let's say, mean about it, or you can tell that it's coming from a place of negative racism, let's say latent racism, or if it's coming from a place of blind ignorance. And but then you have enough of a rapport with that person that you would realize that it's not as though they're trying to hurt you, and they're really just not aware of what they're saying. So all of that are things that I always have been very cognizant of, and I And depending on, as I said, who it's coming from, what I feel their intent is, it depends on my reaction. But it's always a teaching moment for
To
me.
monitor, observe for pattern behavior,
Yes.
and then take the proactive nature of the experience and having a momentous one-to-one that
Right.
allows the individual or individuals to reflect on what had happened, how that made others feel,
Yeah,
and potentially give them the opportunity to change.
absolutely.
In the realm of Black Lives Matter, what can corporations, whether you are in nonprofit, in profit, in public sector, private sector, what can organizations do to walk the talk? And I'm very passionate about what are we doing to up the ante, to accelerate and recover reform from the cause sooner
Right.
than later, so that
Right.
you can see some change happening in the near future versus the future.
Is they should be examining their own senior level management and positions, senior level positions, let's say, those who are in, who are making the decisions, especially those making the decisions regarding hiring and firing, um, and making sure that it's represented with people of color and, let's say, Black people, because I find often that is not the case. You know, you might find a corporation where maybe there's one token that might be at a senior level, and then maybe they have some sprinkled throughout a workforce at different levels. But I believe the real change can only happen if we are represented at those levels, the levels of where decisions are being made as far as who's being hired, those who are setting the culture for the for their actual business and workforce, setting the culture, um, making sure that it's a non-toxic environment as far as racism is concerned, making sure that um, the people that are working there are well educated with anti-Black racism. So if that means offering training and seminars and these kinds of things, yeah, just really taking a good hard look at their culture, and seeing you know how many people of color are working there, if there are any issues that are being reported, et cetera, from people of color that are experiencing any kind of, let's say, racist behavior towards them, this kind of thing. They should be taking a good hard look at their current employers and making sure that, first of all, their people are represented at the higher levels, yeah, of people that are being hired and fired, and making sure that, yeah, there's a constant representation that's happening, and the people that are working for them are aware of anti-Black racism, and sensitivity training, these kinds of things, making sure that they're aware of how they're interacting with people of color, so that the culture is continuously being deemed as, let's say, a safe workspace for people of color. Achieve the same amounts of, let's say, um, benefits and for promotion. Let's say promotions that are available, development, training, these kinds of things. So their own skills are being cultivated, and that they're not feeling left out of the pool.
What we have in our series and throughout the episodes, Trish, and I'm going to surprise you here with what we normally do is this notion of a gotcha question.
Okay.
And we have this virtual fishbowl and we dip into that. And normally, whoever is moderating gets a chance to ask a question that hadn't been given in advance. The gotcha question number one is, in the realm of what you just said, having not just the recognition of representation in the workforce of Black people at the table for hiring, firing, promotional activities and programs, and at the leadership board, at the board. One of the things that I have taken notice is full on statistics and looking at documentation. You and I discussed a number of these that have been percolating in
Yes.
different social media platforms. And I had seen a recent CNBC documentary which had claimed that over the last 8 years, that in the high tech community where I am,
Right.
that there has been only 1% of the Black community who have been hired into high tech in the last 8 years. And
Wow.
this is reality. It's not a feeling, it's not
No,
an emotional stance. This is fact.
that's a
And
fact.
so,
Yeah.
with these facts, what would you say to the individuals that say, well, Black folks need to just try harder and
Right.
focus on getting into these fields because it seems like they don't want to get into these fields. And I
Right.
don't believe that's the source of the problem,
Truth. Right.
right? Because as your earlier point and some of the other Black female leaders have mentioned, is that in early parts of their schooling and job experience, they've already been told that who they are
Hmm.
puts them at the back of the line, thereby systemically, you
Yes.
have this notion of no hope at a young age. And
Absolutely.
so I don't want to lead the witness here, but
No.
what is your position on that type of attitude? And
Right.
truly, what do you believe needs to happen around community, around organizations to help foster the younger Black female leaders and all visible minority folks who are not represented in a statistical sense in
Right.
that particular field or career
Right.
to get into that career?
I feel strongly that basically it does happen at a very young age, and it does begin at, let's say, even the elementary school level. Um, that kids, often kids of color, and particularly Black kids, are underestimated. Um, and just as you said, they might be told, what, this particular level or course and so on is not something that you will probably be able to achieve. So instead of pushing and let's say assisting them in achieving higher um, grades and as far as their grades and level of education, etc., they're pushed into more of the remedial courses and these kinds of things uh, because of the fact that they're underestimated. These things are happening on a daily basis by teachers who are teaching these students in classrooms. And you know, my husband being an actual teacher, right now he's going through anti-Black sensitivity training before the beginning of the school year, which starts next week. Um,
And most
and
Canadians or Americans or those in the first world nation might see this as an optimistic path to leading towards change because this never was implemented in the past before back to school.
Exactly. And so that's one of the positive things that's happening right now, I think, with the movement is as where everyone's talking about we're all focusing on it, and things like this is happening where, now teachers are receiving this kind of training. And just had a quick conversation with my husband who just got off finishing one of his segments, and basically how much he learned just within the first few hours of people speaking
Fantastic.
about their experiences and this kind of thing. This kind of stuff needs to continue. I think, once, let's say, it gets down to the teacher level and they're educated with a sensitivity training and anti-Black racism training and these kinds of things, they themselves will be more aware of how they're treating students and people of color. Um, and I think, right away that's one step in the right direction. I also think that it would be great for corporations such as, you're in the tech industry, corporations to make sure that they are starting to go out to schools and
Bingo.
yeah, and with the topic of anti-Black racism and people of color in mind, make sure that they are encouraging students, all students really, but particularly students of color, et cetera, to entice them into their industry and basically say, hey, there's opportunities for you here, because of the fact that they should be aware that is minimal representation of people of color in these particular industries. I think a lot of times they're just not aware of
I love that. I love that because we all put that onus on academia.
Yeah.
And it should be owned by the corporations who want to hire for the future. And just like we have started doing or accelerated doing for STEM,
yes,
we should be doing it also for the visible minority communities where we see the least Asian, Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian, Black communities, not in these particular professions, being bold and passionate and meaningful in their programs to want to hire and encourage somebody at an earlier age in their education to want to look into these type of careers. And so one of the things that I have seen is definitely academia picking up on that, and they have gone through, like University of Toronto, gone after those students who were invisible minorities and very specifically targeted to the Black community of students who had very high GPAs but couldn't afford to go to medical school, and they started funding and getting corporations to back it up, because you can't allow money to be the reason why someone can't get education.
And I love that you brought up the point of the financial barriers, and corporations using that as or getting on board with that, and assistance being available for these people who probably just will never be able to achieve these goals because they just don't have the money.
The last gotcha question is mostly around your hope, and there's no right and wrong answer to any of these gotcha questions, and it's by design. In closing off on the topic, I wanted you to share your opinion on what is your hope that in your lifetime that you can see pivotal change in the Black Lives Movement that happens while you are alive. If you could see something change in your lifetime, what would that be?
Well, actually, to be honest, it's already happening. I love the fact that the conversation is right now top of mind because of what has been happening. That is something that I feel very encouraged by. Now, what needs to happen and what I'm a little well, I'm not quite sure if it will happen within my own lifetime. But I'm hopeful that it will, especially with the young people getting on board and driving it forward, is that this conversation will continue, and then be, action will start taking place. Meaning, it's one thing for people to be talking about it right now, but it's another thing to keep this conversation going continuously. I am very hopeful that now that the light has been sparked, let's say, or the fire has been sparked, that it will continue burning, and that we all of us will continue the conversation, and actually people will begin to put these things into action. um, uh, do I believe it will happen fully in my lifetime? No, but I hope that it continues and just continues to build momentum, that maybe the next generation, by the time they're the ones who are making all of the decisions and leading the world, etc., that there will be some major shifts in the way that people behave and perceive Black people and people of color.
Thank you so much for spending part of your valuable afternoon with us. I appreciated your point of view. The diversity in the perspectives is so helpful for the audience out there, for the Gen Z and the millennials who are behind us, learning from the experiences that we have had, that we are having, and hopefully paving the way for some major accountability that they can have to make changes as a woman in leadership of tomorrow. So thank you very much once again. I'm very much open to you coming on board for other future topics if
I'd
you will
love
have
to.
that,
I'd love to.
and continue this conversation forward with other challenges and other topics. So with that, thank you very much. Bid you good
Thank
night,
you.
and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Esther. This was great.